The night I found out my parents sold my company, I was sitting alone in a glass office that still had my fingerprints on every surface. The city below was alive, sirens, laughter, headlights slicing through rain, but inside, everything went silent. My phone buzzed once, then again. Then the headline appeared like a slap I didn't see coming. Family-owned tech giant acquired for $1.2 billion. And right there, buried in the article like an afterthought, was my name, listed under former CEO. They didn't call me first. They didn't warn me. They didn't even explain. They sold the company I built. They fired me. And they forgot something that would change everything. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my story of betrayal. And if you've ever trusted the wrong person, hit that subscribe button because you are not alone. Here is how it happened. I remember staring at the reflection in the window, wondering when my own parents stopped seeing me as their child and started seeing me as an obstacle. The rain streaked the glass like the city was crying with me, or maybe laughing. It felt unreal, like the kind of nightmare where you're screaming but no sound comes out. Except this was real, legally binding, signed, sealed, announced to the world. Just 2 hours earlier, I had been celebrating a breakthrough. Our platform, my platform, had finally stabilized after months of sleepless nights. The code was clean, elegant, alive. It was the kind of system investors dream about and competitors try to copy but never quite get right. I had written the core architecture myself, line by line, back when we were nothing more than a rented server and a shared belief that we could build something bigger than us. My parents were there in the early days, or at least they were around. They funded the first office, they introduced me to their friends, they smiled in photos. But the truth? They never understood the code. They understood balance sheets, optics, control, and somewhere along the way, they decided those things mattered more than me. The board meeting invitation came late that evening, after the deal was already done. A calendar notification, no message, no explanation, just a location and a time, like I was an employee being summoned to HR. That's when my hands started shaking, not from fear, from disbelief. I walked into that room the next morning and saw strangers sitting where my team used to sit. New suits, new smiles, the kind that don't reach the eyes. My parents were at the head of the table, composed, rehearsed, calm in a way that felt surgical. My mother didn't meet my gaze. My father folded his hands and cleared his throat like he was about to read the weather. "We've decided to move forward without you," he said. Without me. I waited for the punchline, for the apology, for the explanation that would make this make sense. Instead, a man I'd never met slid a folder across the table toward me. Severance, NDA, a thank you letter already signed. They had planned this, every detail, except the part where I would fight back. As I stood there, the room spinning slightly, something strange happened. A memory surfaced, one I hadn't thought about in years. Late nights, cold pizza, the original repository, the clause my lawyer friend insisted I add when no one else was paying attention. I remembered smiling back then, telling him it was probably unnecessary. It wasn't unnecessary. I was reading comments on my YouTube videos the other day, and I realized I wasn't the only one. People wrote about siblings who stole inheritances, partners who took credit, parents who crossed lines that should never be crossed. Betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it comes from the people who taught you to trust. I left the building without signing anything. Cameras flashed outside. Reporters shouted my name. "How does it feel?" one of them asked. I didn't answer. I just kept walking, my mind racing, replaying every decision that led to this moment. Every time I chose family over legal protection. Every time I assumed blood was thicker than contracts. That night, alone again, I opened my laptop, the same one I'd used to build the first prototype years ago. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, muscle memory kicking in like I'd never left. I logged into a system no one else in that billion-dollar deal even knew existed. And that's when I saw it. Confirmation that they had no idea what they just bought. Because while they owned the company on paper, I owned the code that made it worth $1.2 billion. And the clock had just started ticking. The cursor blinked on my screen like a heartbeat, steady, patient, waiting for me to decide what kind of person I was about to become. Outside, the city had finally gone quiet, that deep, hollow silence that only comes after midnight when ambition sleeps and regret stays awake. I cracked my knuckles, not out of habit, but to ground myself. This wasn't revenge, that's what I told myself. This was correction. This was balance. When I first started the company, it wasn't supposed to be an empire. It was supposed to be mine. I was 24, broke in every way except mentally, living off instant noodles and caffeine. The idea came to me after watching my parents argue at the dinner table, again, about money, influence, and legacy. They spoke about business like it was war. I wanted to build something different, something clean, something honest. The core algorithm took me almost a year to design. I didn't outsource it. I didn't delegate it. I wrote it myself because I didn't trust anyone else to understand the soul of what we were creating. It wasn't just software. It was a living system that adapted, learned, and protected itself. Every decision it made was traceable. Every outcome explainable. Investors loved the pitch, engineers loved the challenge, but no one ever truly understood how deep it went, except me. My parents thought they owned the company because they owned the majority shares. That's what their lawyers told them. That's what the buyers believed. And technically, they were right. The logo, the office, the brand, all of it was sold cleanly, wrapped in legal bows and billion-dollar smiles. But the code? The code was a different story. I had registered it years ago under a separate intellectual property entity, a quiet one, an entity my parents dismissed as a side project when they saw the paperwork. They trusted me back then, or more accurately, they underestimated me. The licensing agreement allowed the company to use the code, not own it. And there was a clause, buried, precise, merciless, that stated the license was valid only as long as I remained an active executive with decision-making authority, which, as of that morning, I wasn't. I opened the admin console. My access was still intact. Of course it was. No one thinks to lock out the person who built the doors. I watched the system logs scroll past, each line confirming what I already suspected. The new owners were running live tests, pushing the platform harder than ever, scaling it globally within hours of acquisition. Greedy, impatient. They had no idea how fragile it could become without the right hands guiding it. I could have shut it down right then, one command, one keystroke, total blackout. But I didn't. Not yet. I wanted them to feel secure, confident. I wanted them to believe the purchase was the smartest decision they'd ever made. Because the fall hits harder when you're standing tall. My phone rang. My mother's name lit up the screen. I let it ring. Again and again. On the fourth call, I answered, not because I wanted to talk, but because I wanted to hear the lie. "You shouldn't have found out like this," she said softly, like that somehow absolved everything. Found out? I announced it to the world. There was a pause. I could almost hear her choosing words like weapons wrapped in silk. "We did what was best for the company." "No, you did what was best for you." My father took the phone. His voice was colder now, defensive. "You're emotional. This is business." That sentence snapped something inside me. "You fired your own child. That's not business. That's betrayal." He sighed, irritated. "You'll be compensated generously. Sign the papers, walk away with dignity." Walk away from my life's work, from the thing that carried my fingerprints in every line? I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was unbelievable. You sold something you don't fully own, I said. Silence. What does that mean? He asked. It means, I replied slowly, you should tell the new owners to check the licensing agreement carefully. The call ended abruptly. Within an hour, my inbox exploded. Emails from legal teams, subject lines marked urgent, time-sensitive, please advise. I didn't respond. Instead, I leaned back and let myself feel it, the hurt I'd been holding at bay, the realization that the people who raised me had chosen power over protection, control over trust. I thought back to every holiday missed, every conversation cut short because this deal can't wait. I remembered being a kid waiting by the window for my parents to come home, promising myself I'd never become that kind of adult. And yet here we are, circling the same drain just on opposite sides of the table. By morning, the news broke. Tech giant faces uncertainty after founder dispute. Licensing issues cloud $1.2 billion acquisition. The stock dipped, just a little, enough to cause panic, enough to make people ask questions, and questions in this world are dangerous. I finally met with the new owners that afternoon, a video call. Their faces were tense now, confidence replaced by calculation. One of them spoke first. We believe there's been a misunderstanding. I shook my head. No, there's been an assumption. They wanted a solution, a renegotiation. They offered money, more than I'd ever imagined as a kid writing code in a dark apartment. For a moment, I considered it, taking the check, walking away, letting my parents live with the consequences of their choices without my interference. But then one of the executives smiled, just a little, and said, "Your parents assured us you wouldn't be a problem." That's when I knew. This wasn't just about a deal gone wrong. It was about erasure. They wanted my work without my presence, my genius without my name attached to it. I closed my laptop. There's only one way forward, I said. They leaned in. And that's when I told them my terms that would not only decide the future of the company, but permanently fracture my family in ways no contract could ever repair. Because if they thought firing me was the end of the story, they had no idea what I was about to take back. They asked for my terms like men who believed every problem had a price tag. I let the silence stretch, long enough to make them uncomfortable, long enough for the power dynamic to tilt back where it belonged. My terms aren't about money, I finally said. That threw them. You could see it in the way one of them adjusted his tie, the way another leaned back, arms crossed, defensive. In their world, everything was transactional. Every human need could be solved with a number and a signature. "What do you want, then?" the lead negotiator asked. I looked straight into the camera. Control. Not ownership, not a payout. Control. I explained it slowly, deliberately, like you explain something irreversible to people who don't yet realize they're cornered. The code they were running, the system that justified their $1.2 billion valuation, was modular by design. They could scale it, market it, sell access to it, but they couldn't evolve it. Not without me, not without the master keys I never shared. "If you push it the way you're pushing it now," I said, "it will break. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. And when it does, it won't fail loudly. It'll fail quietly. Corrupt data, inconsistent outputs, legal nightmares." They exchanged looks. One of them asked the question I knew was coming. "Is that a threat?" I smiled. "It's a warning." The call ended with no agreement, just a promise to review options, corporate code for "we're scrambling." That evening, my parents came to see me. Not together. My mother arrived first, unannounced, standing in my doorway like she was afraid I'd disappear if she blinked. She looked smaller somehow, older. The confidence she wore in boardrooms was gone, replaced by something fragile and unfamiliar. "We didn't think it would come to this," she said. I didn't invite her in. "You thought I'd roll over, like I always do." Her eyes filled, but I'd learned the hard way that tears weren't always remorse. Sometimes they were just another tactic. "We were trying to protect you. The pressure was too much. The company was getting dangerous." Dangerous, the word echoed. "You didn't protect me," I said quietly. "You replaced me." She reached for my hand. I stepped back. "You taught me to build something that couldn't be taken from me, and then you tried anyway." She left without another word. My father called later that night. No apologies, no softness, just anger sharpened into resolve. "You're embarrassing us. Undo this." Undo this, as if betrayal were a spreadsheet error. "You embarrassed yourselves, and you did it the moment you chose profit over your own child." He hung up. The next morning, the platform hiccuped. Nothing catastrophic, just enough. Latency spikes, minor outages in 3 regions. Social media noticed before the engineers did. Hashtags started trending. Analysts speculated. Competitors circled like sharks sensing blood. I watched it all from my dashboard, hands steady, heart racing. I hadn't touched the system, not directly. The instability was organic, the result of aggressive scaling without proper oversight, exactly as I'd predicted, exactly as they'd ignored. By noon, the buyers were back on the call. "We need you," one of them said, voice tight. I nodded. "I know." They offered a revised deal, more money, a public apology, a consultant role with no real authority. They still didn't get it. "I'm not coming back as decoration. I come back as the architect, full veto power on technical decisions, permanent." One of them scoffed. "You're asking us to undermine the board." I leaned forward. "You already undermined the product. I'm offering to save it." Another silence. Longer this time. Behind the scenes, my parents were working their own angles. I found out through a leak, one of the old legal assistants who still trusted me. They were trying to challenge the IP ownership, claim coercion, misrepresentation, anything that would drag this into court and bury it under years of litigation. That hurt more than the firing. They weren't just willing to erase me, they were willing to rewrite history to do it. I thought back to childhood again, not the good memories, but the formative ones. The times I'd been praised not for effort, but for results. The unspoken rule that love was conditional on success. Maybe this was always how it was going to end. That night, I made a decision. I drafted a public letter. Not an attack, not a rant, just facts, timelines, receipts. I explained my role in building the system, the licensing structure, the reason the acquisition was unstable. I didn't name my parents directly, but anyone with half a brain could connect the dots. Before I hit publish, I hesitated. Once this went out, there was no going back. No family dinners, no quiet reconciliations. This would burn bridges that could never be rebuilt. I thought back to the comments again, the messages from strangers who'd been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect them, the ones who said, "I wish I'd stood up for myself sooner." I hit publish. The internet did what it always does. It exploded. Within hours, my name was everywhere. Some called me a genius, others called me ungrateful. Armchair psychologists dissected my childhood. Business channels ran split screens with exclusive banners and furrowed brows. And in the middle of it all, the company's valuation dropped another 8%. The buyers panicked, the board fractured, emergency meetings stacked on top of emergency meetings. The deal that was supposed to crown my parents as visionaries was turning into a case study in hubris. Late that night, I received one final message from my father. Just 4 words. "You've gone too far." I stared at the screen, feeling something unexpected rise in my chest. Not guilt, not fear, relief. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to earn their approval, and the next move I was about to make wouldn't just change the company, it would decide whether my parents lost everything they'd built trying to control me. The moment my father said, "You've gone too far," I realized something chillingly simple. He still thought he was in control. I didn't reply, not because I had nothing to say, but because silence at that moment was the loudest weapon I had. Instead, I watched. The dashboards, the news cycle, the quiet panic spreading through boardrooms like a slow infection. The company's engineers were working around the clock now. I recognized their commits, their frantic patches, the telltale signs of people trying to fix a machine without understanding its blueprint. They were talented. Some of them I had personally hired, but talent without context is just guessing. And guessing at this scale costs millions per hour. The buyers called again the next morning. This time, no smiles, no posture, no games. "We accept your terms," the lead negotiator said. "All of them." I exhaled slowly. "Put it in writing." They did, within minutes. Full architectural control, permanent executive authority over all technical decisions, public acknowledgement as the original architect, and one more thing, my addition. A clause stating that any attempt to legally challenge my ownership of the core IP would immediately revoke the license. They signed it, but before I countersigned, I asked one question. What about my parents? The pause on the other end told me everything. "They'll remain shareholders," he said carefully, "but they're stepping back from operational control, effective immediately." So that was it. The crown they traded me for was already slipping. I signed. The market reacted instantly. Confidence rebounded. Headlines shifted tone. Founder returns to stabilize tech giant. The stock climbed, slowly, cautiously, but enough to stop the bleeding. On paper, I'd won. Emotionally, I was standing in the wreckage of a family that might never recover. My parents requested a meeting, neutral location, no lawyers, no executives, just us. I agreed against my better judgment. We sat across from each other in a quiet, private room, the kind designed to absorb sound and secrets. My mother looked exhausted. My father looked furious, at me, at himself, at the world. "You humiliated us," he began. "No," I said. "You humiliated yourselves." He slammed his hand on the table. "We gave you everything." I replied, "I gave you a future." That stopped him. My mother finally spoke. "We were afraid," she said. "Afraid you'd burn out, afraid the company would collapse if something happened to you." "So you removed me?" I asked. "We thought you'd come back," she whispered. "Grateful." That word, again. "I didn't build this to be grateful," I said. "I built it to be free." The meeting ended with no resolution, no apology, no closure, just the unspoken understanding that whatever we'd been before was gone. Over the next weeks, I dove back into the system, cleaning, repairing, rebuilding trust with teams who didn't know which side they were supposed to be on. Some avoided eye contact, others quietly thanked me for coming back. A few admitted they'd suspected something was wrong the day I disappeared from the org chart. But something else was happening too, something darker. I started noticing anomalies. Not system errors, not scaling issues, human ones. Meetings canceled without explanation, decisions delayed, documents missing, and always, just beneath the surface, resistance, subtle, polite, dangerous. Then I found it. An internal proposal, dated after the acquisition but before my return. A contingency plan, code-named Project Severance. It outlined a strategy to gradually replace my architecture with a reverse-engineered alternative, not immediately, slowly, quietly, over 18 months, long enough for my licensing leverage to expire under a restructured framework. They were planning to erase me again, this time permanently. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding, not with fear, but with clarity. This wasn't about my parents anymore. This was about a system that rewarded betrayal as long as it was profitable. I had two options: expose it, go public again, burn everything down, or build something they could never touch. That night, I accessed the original repository, the one I'd archived years ago, the version of the system before investors, before boards, before compromise. I started rewriting, not for scale, not for valuation, for independence. A parallel architecture, cleaner, smarter, autonomous, one that could operate outside the company entirely. If they wanted to play long games, I could play longer. Days later, an unexpected message landed in my inbox. From my mother. Subject line, "Please read." Inside was a forwarded email chain, private, never meant for me to see. Conversations between my parents and the buyers, dated months before the sale. They had planned my removal from the very beginning. Not because I was unstable, not because I was a risk, but because I wouldn't give them full ownership of the code. My mother added one line at the bottom. "I didn't know how far your father had gone until now." I stared at the screen, feeling something crack open inside me. This wasn't just betrayal, it was premeditated, and the people who raised me chose their legacy over my existence. I closed my laptop slowly, because the next move I made wouldn't just protect my work. It would decide who walked away from this story with a future and who would be remembered as a cautionary tale. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was angry. Anger burns fast and fades. This was something colder, heavier, the kind of clarity that settles in when the last illusion finally dies. My parents hadn't panicked. They hadn't reacted impulsively. They had planned my removal months in advance. Every memory replayed differently now. The sudden distance, the forced smiles, the meetings I was quietly excluded from, the way my father insisted on streamlining leadership, the way my mother avoided my eyes whenever I talked about long-term control. I wasn't being protected. I was being phased out. By morning, I made a decision that terrified me, not because it was risky, but because it was final. I would stop defending what I built. I would outgrow it. I called an emergency meeting with the buyers and the board, cameras on, lawyers present, everyone stiff and polite, pretending we were still on the same team. "I've identified a long-term risk," I said calmly, "one that can't be solved internally." They leaned in. They always leaned in when I spoke like that. "The platform's future depends on independence, and independence isn't possible under the current structure." One board member frowned. "You just regained control. Why destabilize things now?" I met his gaze. "Because someone already tried." I shared the screen. Project Severance. The room changed instantly. People shifted, someone swore under their breath, one executive turned pale as the timeline became clear. "This plan violates the licensing agreement," someone said. "Yes, and the spirit of every promise made to me." The buyers denied knowledge. The board blamed consultants. Fingers pointed in neat, cowardly circles. No one took responsibility, because responsibility is expensive. "So here's what's going to happen," I said. I laid it out. I would remain long enough to stabilize the system and protect clients. During that time, I would publicly announce the creation of a new independent platform, built from scratch, owned entirely by me, and designed to succeed where this one was being slowly hollowed out. No overlap, no IP conflict, no lawsuits. A clean evolution. They could keep the company. I would take the future. "You can't compete with your own product," one executive snapped. I smiled. "Watch me." The meeting ended in chaos, threats dressed up as warnings, legal teams muttering about risk exposure. The buyers asked for time. I gave them 30 days. When the announcement went live, it hit harder than anything before it. Founder launches new independent platform after betrayal allegations. The mind behind the billion-dollar system starts over on his own terms. Developers reached out within hours, old colleagues, quiet geniuses who'd left because they hated politics, engineers who'd watched what happened to me and realized it could happen to them too. They didn't ask about salaries, they asked about values. Investors came next, not the flashy ones, quiet money, patient money, the kind that listens more than it talks. They didn't want control, they wanted alignment. For the first time, I set the rules. Meanwhile, the original company began to fracture. Talent left, morale dipped, clients asked uncomfortable questions. The platform still ran, but without soul, without vision, without the person who understood why it existed in the first place. My parents watched all of this unfold from the sidelines. My mother tried to call again. I didn't answer. My father sent one last message. "You're destroying everything we worked for." I typed back 3 words. "You already did." The hardest part wasn't walking away from the company. It was accepting that some people will always choose power over love and call it responsibility. 3 weeks before my exit date, something unexpected happened. The buyers made a final offer. Full reinstatement, majority control, a public admission of wrongdoing, even an apology from my parents, drafted by PR, but still an apology. It was everything I'd once thought I wanted. I read it twice. Then I declined, because freedom tastes different once you've had it. On my last day, I cleared out my office, same glass walls, same city below, different person standing there. I left behind a letter for the team, not dramatic, not bitter, just honest. I thanked them, I warned them, I told them to protect their work and themselves. As I walked out, I didn't look back, because I wasn't losing anything anymore. I was choosing myself. But what I didn't know, what no one told me, was that my departure would trigger a final move from my father, one that would push this story from betrayal into something far more dangerous. And when I found out what he'd done behind closed doors, I realized this wasn't over, not even close. I found out about my father's final move the same way I'd found out about the sale. Not from him, not from my mother, not from anyone who claimed to be family. I found out through a lawyer. A thin, carefully worded email landed in my inbox at 6:12 a.m. Subject: Notice of legal action, immediate attention required. I opened it half awake. By the time I finished reading, sleep was a distant memory. My father had filed an emergency injunction, not against the company, not against the buyers, against me. He was claiming that my new platform was a derivative work, that I had subconsciously reused proprietary logic, that my independence was an illusion, and that legally, everything I touched belonged to what he still believed was his empire. It was ruthless, calculated, and personal. He wasn't trying to win in business anymore. He was trying to erase me completely. The injunction didn't shut me down, but it froze key partnerships. Investors hesitated. Potential hires paused. The message was clear. Work with him, and you'll be dragged into court. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about legacy. This was about punishment. I called my mother. She answered immediately, voice shaking. I didn't know he was going to do this. I believed her. "He's trying to take everything," I said, "even now." There was a long pause. Then she whispered, "He's afraid." Afraid, not of losing the company, but of losing the story. My father had built his identity on control, on being the architect behind the scenes, and now the world knew the truth. Worse, he knew it. I met with my legal team that afternoon. No panic, no theatrics, just quiet confidence. "This is weak," my lead counsel said, "emotion-driven and dangerous for him." "Why dangerous?" I asked. "Because to prove his claim," she replied, "he'd have to open discovery." Discovery. The word hung in the air like a loaded gun. Discovery would expose internal emails, planning documents, the early conversations about removing me, Project Severance, the truth, not just about what happened, but why. If this went to court, my father wouldn't just lose the case, he'd lose his reputation, and he knew it, which meant this injunction wasn't the endgame, it was leverage. I received a call that night from an unknown number. I already knew who it was. "You forced my hand," my father said. "You forced it yourself," I replied. He didn't argue. He went straight to the threat. "Drop the platform, publicly, walk away. I'll withdraw the injunction. And if I don't, then I'll make sure no one ever trusts you again." There it was, the final line. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of a lifetime pressing down on my chest. The child in me, the one who'd spent years trying to earn approval, finally went quiet. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," I said. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You think this ends well for you?" "I think it ends honestly, for the first time." I hung up. The next morning, I did something unexpected. I went public again, but not with accusations, with receipts. A carefully curated timeline, emails, signed documents, dated proposals, proof that my father had planned my removal long before any concern about stability, proof that Project Severance existed, proof that the injunction was retaliation, not protection. I didn't insult him. I didn't name him directly. I let the facts speak. And they were loud. Within hours, the narrative flipped. Business journalists tore into the documents. Legal analysts weighed in. Former employees came forward with stories that mirrored mine. Decisions overridden, voices silenced, credit reassigned. The injunction became a liability. Investors pressured my father to withdraw it. The buyers panicked again, realizing they'd underestimated the reputational blast radius. By day 3, the injunction was gone, withdrawn voluntarily. My platform roared back to life. Partnerships resumed, talent flooded in, momentum returned, but this time it was different, cleaner, stronger, built on trust instead of fear. And then came the call I never expected, from the board of the original company. They wanted a meeting, not to negotiate, not to threaten, to inform. My father was being removed, not quietly, not gracefully, formally, permanently. They cited reputational risk, breach of fiduciary duty, loss of confidence, the very language he'd once used to justify removing me. When I hung up, I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty. Because no matter how justified it was, no matter how necessary, watching your parent fall is not a win. My mother called later that night. She was crying, not dramatically, just tired. "He's alone," she said, "and he doesn't understand how it happened." I did. It happens when you confuse control with love long enough that you forget the difference. The story should have ended there. Justice served, power redistributed, a new future secured. But there was one final truth I hadn't faced yet, something my father had done years ago, quietly, legally, that would resurface now and threaten everything I'd rebuilt. And when I uncovered it, I realized the real climax of this story wasn't about a company. It was about ownership of identity itself. I discovered the final truth by accident. Not through a lawsuit, not through a whistleblower, but through a routine background check. One of our largest enterprise partners required an exhaustive compliance review before finalizing integration. Standard stuff, corporate hygiene. I'd done it 100 times before. I approved it without a second thought. 3 days later, my general counsel walked into my office and closed the door behind her. She didn't sit down. "There's an issue," she said. Those words have weight when spoken by someone who never panics. "What kind of issue?" I asked. She slid a document across my desk. A trust filing, dated 12 years earlier. My name was on it. So was my father's. I scanned it once, then again, then a third time slower, feeling something cold coil in my stomach. My father had created a founder's legacy trust back when I was still in my 20s, before the company was anything more than an idea, back when I trusted him implicitly, back when I signed documents without lawyers because family doesn't screw family. The trust didn't give him ownership of my companies. It gave him something worse: control over my intellectual output in the event I was deemed unfit to manage. Unfit. The word blurred on the page. The trust was dormant, never triggered, never mentioned, but legally valid, and the definition of unfit was flexible, vague, dangerous. Mental health, reputational harm, legal instability, anything that could be argued, anything that could be manufactured. My father hadn't lost his power, he just changed the battlefield. "If this is activated," I said slowly, "what happens?" She didn't sugarcoat it. "He could petition for temporary control over your IP, including the new platform, especially if he frames your public actions as destabilizing." "So he could take everything," I whispered. "He could try." I sat back, breath shallow. This was it. The move beneath the move, the contingency beneath the contingency, a chess piece placed so long ago I'd forgotten the game even existed. My father hadn't just planned my removal from the company, he'd planned for the possibility that I'd resist. That night I didn't code, I didn't call lawyers, I went back to the beginning. I pulled out old journals, emails, voice notes, every record I had from the early years, not for strategy, for truth. I needed to understand how deep this went, whether this was paranoia or pattern. And the pattern was unmistakable. Every time I asserted independence, my father reframed it as instability. Every time I disagreed, he called it emotional. Every time I protected my work, he labeled it selfish. He hadn't seen me as a person, he'd seen me as a variable. I called him the next morning, not angry, not defensive, clear. "I know about the trust," I said. Silence. Then a sigh, slow, measured, like a man realizing the board was visible now. "It was for your protection," he said. "No," I replied. "It was for your leverage. You don't understand the pressure I was under, the risk you posed." "The risk of what? Being myself?" He didn't answer. "I'm not your extension. I'm not your contingency plan. I'm not something you get to activate when you feel irrelevant." "You're spiraling," he said sharply. "This is exactly why it exists." There it was, the trigger word. I felt it then, not rage, not fear, but certainty. "You're not going to use it," I said. He laughed softly. "You think you can stop me?" "Yes," I replied, "because if you try, I'll destroy the one thing you value more than control." "What's that?" he asked. "The story you tell yourself about who you are." I hung up. The next 48 hours were a blur. We moved fast, faster than he expected. My legal team filed a preemptive action challenging the trust's enforceability, arguing coercion, imbalance of power, lack of independent counsel. We attached evidence, mountains of it. But that wasn't the real move. The real move was public. I released a single video. No accusations, no dramatics, just me, talking. I told the story, not of the company, not of the betrayal, but of control disguised as care, of how easily brilliance is mistaken for instability when it refuses to be owned, of how families sometimes confuse legacy with possession. I didn't name him. I didn't need to. The response was immediate, overwhelming. Survivors of controlling parents, founders silenced by mentors, people who'd been told their autonomy was a threat. The trust, once invisible, became radioactive. If my father tried to activate it now, it wouldn't look like protection. It would look like exactly what it was: ownership of a human being. 2 days later, his lawyers reached out. They wanted a settlement. Quiet, clean, final. He would dissolve the trust permanently, publicly, irrevocably. In exchange, I would not pursue damages. I agreed, not because I needed mercy, but because I wanted closure. The trust was dissolved the following week. No fanfare, no press release, just a filing that quietly ended a 12-year shadow over my life. When it was done, I sat alone in my office and felt something unfamiliar: peace. But there was still one part of the story left, one question I hadn't answered, not for the world, but for myself. What do you do after you win, when winning costs you your family? Winning is quiet. That was the first thing I noticed after everything stopped shaking. No applause, no sudden rush of happiness, just silence. Wide, open, unfamiliar silence. The trust was gone. The injunction was gone. The shadow my father had cast over my work, my mind, my identity, gone. And yet, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt awake. For the first time in my life, there was no invisible hand hovering over my decisions, no second voice in my head asking, how will this look? Will this disappoint them? Is this too much? I realized how much of myself I'd been editing just to stay loved. My new platform launched quietly. No hype cycle, no manufactured drama, just substance. Clients onboarded because they believed in the product, not the myth around it. Engineers worked without fear of being raced. Decisions were made in the open. We weren't chasing valuation. We were building something honest. And it worked. Not explosively, sustainably. Weeks later, my mother asked to meet. I almost said no, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation. Healing doesn't mean reopening every wound. But something in her message felt different, smaller, human. So I agreed. She looked older than I remembered, not just in years, but in weight. The kind of weight that comes from realizing too late that silence is also a choice. I should have stopped him, she said. I didn't interrupt. She continued, I told myself it wasn't my place, that you were strong enough, that it was business. She looked at me then, really looked. I see now that I let him turn love into leverage. I nodded. I needed you to choose me. She cried, not loudly, not theatrically, just a quiet release. I'm choosing you now, she said. And for the first time, I believed her. We didn't fix everything that day. We didn't rewrite the past, but we set boundaries, real ones. and that mattered more than apologies. My father didn't reach out. I didn't expect him to. Some people can't survive outside control structures. When they lose power, they lose language. I heard through others that he was retired, advising quietly, keeping his head down. I didn't feel satisfaction in that. I felt acceptance. Because here's the truth no one tells you about betrayal, especially when it comes from family. Closure doesn't always come with reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with clarity. I stopped asking why he did it. I stopped needing him to understand me. And in that space, something unexpected grew. Freedom. Months later, I stood in front of my team, our team, during a small internal event. No cameras, no press, just people who'd chosen to be there. Someone asked me, "If you could go back, would you change anything?" I thought about the sale, the firing, the court filings, the nights staring at code wondering if I'd lose everything. And I answered honestly, no. Because if it hadn't happened, I might have spent my entire life confusing permission with love, confusing loyalty with silence, confusing success with approval. They sold my company for $1.2 billion and fired me. They forgot I owned the code, but more importantly, they forgot I owned myself. If you're listening to this and you're building something, whether it's a company, a career, or just a version of yourself, hear me clearly. Read what you sign, protect what you create, and never let anyone convince you that love requires obedience, especially not the people who taught you how to dream. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about reclamation. And if my story sounds like yours, if you've ever felt erased, controlled, or quietly pushed aside, remember this. You are not replaceable. You are not a liability. And you are not owned. Not by family, not by power, not by fear. Thank you for staying with me until the end.